The sound of breaking glass shattered the evening calm. That's when Mike Reynolds saw them, three young men surrounding a woman against the brick wall of the corner store. Her eyes met his across the street, wide with fear, silently pleading for help. Mike wasn't looking for trouble. As a single father working 2 jobs, he had enough on his plate. But sometimes, life doesn't give you a choice about becoming someone's hero. What happened in the next 60 seconds would change multiple lives forever. If you've ever wondered whether ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, this story might just restore your faith in humanity. Like and subscribe to see more real-life stories that remind us of the courage hiding inside everyday heroes. Mike's hands trembled slightly as he set his grocery bags down on the sidewalk. At 42, he wasn't the imposing figure he'd been in his 20s. Years of working overtime at the factory and late nights helping his daughter with homework had etched permanent exhaustion into his face. His knees ached from an old construction injury, and the thought of confronting 3 men half his age made his stomach clench. But he couldn't walk away, not when someone needed help. The woman was perhaps in her mid-30s, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. One of the men had his hand pressed against the wall beside her head, leaning in too close. The other 2 were laughing, creating a human barrier between her and escape. Mike couldn't hear what they were saying, but the woman's rigid posture told him everything he needed to know. "Hey!" Mike called out, his voice steadier than he felt as he crossed the street. "Everything okay over there?" The tallest of the 3 turned, sizing Mike up with a dismissive glance. "Mind your business, old man. We're just having a friendly conversation." Mike noticed how the woman's eyes never left his, silently communicating her distress. He'd seen that look before, in his daughter's eyes the time she'd called him to pick her up from a party that had taken a bad turn. That memory propelled him forward despite his better judgment. "Looks like the lady might be done with the conversation," Mike said, stopping a few feet away. "How about you fellas move along?" The second man stepped toward Mike, close enough that he could smell the alcohol on his breath. "How about you move along before you get hurt?" Mike's heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't a fighter. Never had been. As a single dad raising 16-year-old Lily after her mother died of cancer 5 years ago, he'd learned to avoid conflict, to solve problems with patience and words. But sometimes words weren't enough. "I don't want trouble," Mike said, raising his hand slightly. "But I'm not leaving until she does. Safely." The third man, who had remained quiet until now, pulled something from his pocket that caught the streetlight, a small knife with a serrated edge. "Your choice, hero." Time seemed to slow. Mike thought about Lily waiting at home, probably wondering why he was late bringing the ingredients for the dinner they'd planned to cook together. He thought about the stack of bills on his kitchen counter. He thought about the promise he'd made to his late wife to stay safe, to be there for their daughter. But he also thought about what kind of man he wanted to be, the kind Lily could be proud of. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, when the police asked for statements, witnesses would give conflicting accounts. Mike lunged forward, not toward the man with the knife, but toward the woman. In one fluid motion, he positioned himself between her and the 3 men. "Run," he whispered to her. "Now." The woman hesitated for just a moment, her eyes filled with gratitude and concern, before slipping away from the wall and hurrying down the street. The man with the knife cursed and moved toward Mike, but something unexpected happened. A deep voice boomed from across the street, "Police! Drop the weapon." Officer James Wilson had just finished his shift and was heading to his car when he spotted the confrontation. In uniform and with his hand on his holstered weapon, his authoritative presence caused the street to go suddenly, completely silent. The knife clattered to the pavement. The 3 young men raised their hands, their bravado evaporating in an instant. As Officer Wilson approached with caution, calling for backup on his radio, Mike felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. The woman had stopped at a safe distance, watching as the officer handcuffed the man who had held the knife. "You okay, sir?" Officer Wilson asked Mike, who could only nod, the adrenaline still coursing through his system making speech difficult. Later, after giving his statement and watching the 3 men being placed in the back of a patrol car, Mike retrieved his grocery bags, now containing slightly wilted lettuce and warming ice cream. The woman he'd helped approached him, her composure regained but her eyes still reflecting the evening's trauma. "My name is Sarah," she said, extending her hand. "I don't know how to thank you. Most people would have just walked by." Mike shook her hand, embarrassed by the attention. "Mike Reynolds. And I'm not sure that's true. I think most people want to do the right thing." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but wanting and doing are different matters. You put yourself at risk for a complete stranger." Mike shrugged. "I have a daughter about your age. I'd hope someone would do the same for her." Sarah insisted on buying Mike coffee at the diner across the street. As they sat in a booth by the window, steam rising from their mugs, Mike learned that Sarah was a nurse at the local hospital. She'd been working a double shift and was walking to her car when the men had approached her, first with comments that seemed harmless, then with increasingly threatening behavior. "I've taken self-defense classes," she admitted, stirring her coffee absently. "But when it actually happened, I froze. Everything I learned just disappeared." "Fear does that," Mike said. "Makes us forget what we know." They talked for nearly an hour. Mike told her about Lily, about raising a teenager alone, about the small construction business he was trying to build while still working factory shifts to make ends meet. Sarah spoke of her work at the hospital, her younger brother who was recovering from addiction, her dream of eventually opening a clinic in an underserved area of the city. By the time Mike glanced at his watch and realized how late it had gotten, something had shifted between them, a connection formed through shared trauma and mutual respect. "I really need to get home," Mike said, reaching for his wallet to pay for the coffee. "My daughter's probably worried." Sarah nodded, but hesitated before saying, "Would it be completely inappropriate if I asked for your number? Maybe to thank you properly with dinner sometime?" Mike felt a warmth spread across his face that had nothing to do with the coffee. It had been years since he'd thought about dating, about sharing his life with someone other than Lily. The idea both terrified and intrigued him. "I'd like that," he said finally, surprising himself with his answer. When Mike arrived home, grocery bags in hand and an hour later than expected, Lily was pacing the living room. "Dad! Where have you been? I called you like 5 times." Her dark hair, so like her mother's, was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her expression shifted from anger to concern as she took in his disheveled appearance. Mike set the bags down and pulled his phone from his pocket, noticing the missed calls. "I'm sorry, honey. Something happened, and I got delayed." As they unpacked the groceries together, Mike carefully recounted the evening's events, downplaying the danger but emphasizing the importance of helping others. Lily listened with wide eyes, her initial irritation forgotten. "So this woman, Sarah, she asked for your number?" Lily asked, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mike nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Is that weird? I mean, it's been a long time since." "Dad," Lily interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. "Mom would want you to be happy. You know that, right?" The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, brought unexpected tears to Mike's eyes. He pulled his daughter into a hug, marveling at her wisdom and the strange turns life could take. The next morning, Mike's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, thanking him again and suggesting dinner that weekend. As he typed his reply, he couldn't help but reflect on how a moment of courage had led to this unexpected new beginning. What Mike didn't know was that someone had recorded the confrontation on their phone. By noon, the video had been uploaded to social media with the caption, "Single dad stands up to 3 thugs harassing woman, watch what happens next." By evening, local news stations were calling, asking for interviews. Mike was uncomfortable with the attention. He'd done what anyone should do, what he hoped anyone would do for Lily if she were in trouble. But the video continued to spread, gathering comments from people inspired by his courage. Officer Wilson stopped by Mike's small construction office the following day. "You're quite the local celebrity," he said with a smile. "The chief wants to present you with a citizen's commendation at the next town council meeting." Mike shook his head. "That's really not necessary. I appreciate it, but I didn't do anything special." "That's where you're wrong," Wilson replied, his expression serious. "In my 15 years on the force, I've seen too many people look the other way. What you did matters, especially these days when it's easier to pull out a phone and record trouble than to step in and stop it." The commendation ceremony was scheduled for the following week. Mike reluctantly agreed to attend, mostly because Lily was so proud and excited. Sarah offered to accompany them, their dinner date having gone surprisingly well, with conversation flowing easily and a genuine connection forming between them. The night before the ceremony, Mike sat on his back porch, nursing a beer and thinking about how quickly life could change. One moment of decision had altered his path in ways he couldn't have imagined. His phone buzzed with a notification, another comment on the video that had now been viewed over 1 million times. "My daughter was helped by a stranger when she was being followed last year. There are still good people in this world. Thank you for reminding us." Mike set his phone down, overwhelmed by the impact his actions had had. He hadn't been looking for recognition or praise. He'd simply seen someone in trouble and decided not to walk away. At the ceremony, the mayor presented Mike with a plaque while Lily and Sarah watched from the front row, both beaming with pride. The 3 young men who had harassed Sarah were facing charges, and the incident had sparked a community discussion about bystander intervention and public safety. "I'm not a hero," Mike said when asked to say a few words. "I'm just a guy who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. The real courage belongs to people like Sarah, who get up every day and take care of others in our hospital. To Officer Wilson and all our first responders who face danger as part of their job. To single parents everywhere who are just trying to raise good kids in a complicated world." He paused, looking at Lily, whose eyes shone with tears and pride. "If there's anything to learn from what happened, it's that we all have moments where we can choose courage over comfort, where we can be the person someone else needs. Those moments define us, not because they make us heroes, but because they make us human." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Mike barely heard it. His focus was on his daughter, on the woman who was quickly becoming important to him, on the community that had embraced him not because he'd done something extraordinary, but because he'd reminded them of their own capacity for courage. 6 months later, Mike's small construction business had grown, partly due to the positive publicity but mostly because of his reputation for honesty and hard work. Sarah had become a regular presence in their lives, bringing laughter back into a home that had known too much sorrow. Lily was applying to colleges, including nursing programs inspired by Sarah's passion for healthcare. And occasionally, when Mike walked down that same street where it had all happened, he would pause at the corner, remembering the moment when fear had nearly overwhelmed him, and how choosing to act despite that fear had changed everything. The video that had captured his act of courage continued to circulate, inspiring others to share their own stories of everyday heroism. A local school had even used it as part of a character education program, teaching students about the importance of standing up for others. Mike never considered himself a hero. He was just a man who'd made a choice in a moment when it mattered. But to Sarah, to Lily, and to countless others who'd been touched by his story, he represented something vital, the reminder that ordinary people, facing ordinary challenges, can still choose extraordinary courage. And in a world that often seems defined by division and indifference, that reminder was perhaps the most heroic gift of all.